multi-layer tutorial where we will be using the Aviationstack API, the Mailboxlayer API, Node Mailer, and Gmail to create this app that allows a user to sign up for email notifications, automated email notifications about a particular flight. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is sign up for all of our various APIs and services that we need. So we're starting with Aviationstack. We also have Mailboxlayer, and then we are going to be using Google App Passwords to authenticate ourselves with Google. So starting with Aviationstack, we can sign up for a free plan. It's going to give us 100 free requests per month. You just need to input some basic information here, scroll down, let them know you're not a robot, and click sign up. And then we can do basically exactly the same thing for the Mailboxlayer API. It is also an API layer API. They have a free plan as well that'll give you 100 free requests per month. And again, put in some basic information, scroll down, tell them you're not a robot, and click create account. For the Google App Passwords, you are going to go to the URL that I'm showing you on the screen right now. And you're basically going to register your app with Google and allow your app to send emails using your personal Gmail account. So in order to do this, you just need to enter the at name. Let's call it something like Flight Notifier, and click create. And then it's going to give you this app password. I've blocked mine out here for privacy's sake, but basically you use that app password to authenticate your app with Google. So let's get familiar with these APIs. The Mailboxlayer API is just an API that lets you validate an email address, which we're going to want to do before we try and send any emails to our user. So they give you one basic endpoint that you can use to send an email address along with your access key and a couple of other optional parameters if you want to, and it will send you back a JSON response telling you whether or not that email is valid. So let's go ahead and use the sandbox here, and here's the response that you get, and it's just a basic JSON response with some information you can use to determine whether or not that email is valid. The Aviationstack API is similar. We'll take a look at the documentation here. And there's a lot more endpoints to this API, but the one we're going to be using is the flights endpoint, and you can hit this with just a basic REST GET request and pass it some optional parameters to filter the results that it gives you, and it's going to basically pull flight information for a given flight. These are the parameters that you can give it, and we are going to be using the departure IATA parameter to narrow down the list of airports. So basically we're going to give it an airport code to tell it that that's the airport our flight is departing from, and then we're going to give it a flight number, and that's just your basic 2-letter and 4-number code that tells you what flight we're looking for. If we didn't give the API these parameters to filter the results, it would give us back an array of like 100 different flights. As you can see here, there's a lot in here. This data array, if you don't pass any options at all, comes back with just like the first 100 flights globally that are happening right now. But we're going to pass it those 2 parameters, and that's going to narrow this whole array down to just one flight, which is the flight that the user is looking for. And then on this flight object, we're going to be able to pull information off of there to determine if there's been any change in the flight. The parameters we're specifically going to look at are the gate and the delay, because those are usually the most important things that any user is looking for. So let's go ahead and just quickly overview how this app is going to work. Basically, the user inputs some flight information, the flight number, the airport code, and their email address. We are then going to send that information to our own backend server. Our server is then going to check that the user's email is valid, and we're going to use Mailboxlayer to do that. If the email is valid, we are then going to pull the flight data for that user from Aviationstack. Once we have that flight information, we're going to check to see if there's any difference in that data from the last time we looked. And we're going to do that by caching the flight data every time we pull it. If there is a difference in the new data between what we have in the cache, then we're going to send an email using Node Mailer and Gmail. And the Gmail is what we just set up with that app password. Then after we send that email, we're going to cache the new data for next time. And eventually we are going to put all of this on a polling function so that this runs automatically every 5 minutes. We pull the data, we check it, and if there's been any change, we send the user an email. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll start by just creating a directory for our app, and we're going to call it Flight Notifier. So we're going to make the Flight Notifier directory, we're going to cd into that directory, and we're going to create inside there 2 folders for ourselves, a folder for the client and a folder for the server. So let's go ahead and create the server folder first, and you can see it in there now. We've got our server directory in there. And then to create the client folder, we're actually going to use create React app, which is going to set us up a nice little React app with all the dependencies and the file structure that we need. And it's going to basically just do everything for us, which is really nice. So let's let that work for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and come back. And we're back, and Create React App is finished setting up that folder. You can see now we have a client folder in here alongside our server folder. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to initialize our server folder as a node project. So we'll go in and we'll run npm init, and we'll go through this setup wizard, and now this server is ready to become a node server. We're going to npm install a few dependencies. We're going to be using Express. This is a framework that's going to help us spin up a node server really quickly and easily. We're going to use .env to manage our environment variables. And then we're going to use Node Mailer to handle sending an email to the user through Gmail. So we go ahead and run that, and those should be installed. And now we can take a look in there and we can see that we've got some node modules. Those are our dependencies. And then we've got this package.json and package.lock or package-lock JSON, and that just lists our dependencies so we can see what they are. Now we're going to go ahead and open up the project in code. We're in the server folder, so let's go ahead and go back up into the top level there, and we're going to open up the whole project in VS Code. Once we're in VS Code, we're going to actually go ahead and start our client. So this is just the front-end React app, which is now running on localhost 3000. And if you go into the browser, you'll see that nice boilerplate that they give us. And here's all the stuff that Create React App gave us. This app file is what you're seeing in the browser there. We've got this nice spinning logo and some text that they gave us. We don't actually need really any of this boilerplate, and we're going to work directly in this file. So let's delete that. And then if you go back into the browser, you'll see that we have a nice blank slate to work with. So the first thing we'll do is build our UI, and I'm just going to paste in some code here so that you guys don't have to sit here and watch me typing it out. This is just our JSX that is going to set up our inputs for the user to give us their information. So this is just a Flexbox div with 3 inputs, 1 for the flight number, 1 for the airport code, and 1 for the user email. The on-change handlers here are just using the use state React handlers. So let's actually go ahead and set up our state right now. We need to capture this user input into state variables using our state handlers. So we'll call this one flight number, and then obviously we've got set flight number is going to be how we update that. And we'll just initialize that as an empty string. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for our airport code and set airport code. And again, we'll just initialize that one as an empty string. And then same thing for the user email and set user email. And again, it's just an empty string. So that's all the state we need in the front end. Very easy. Now when the user inputs, we don't need this anymore, so let's get rid of that. So anytime the user types into one of these input boxes, we are now capturing that value in state so that we can later on send it to our server. So this looks good. And let's go ahead and, oh yeah, this button here, this onPress notify function is what is going to be called when the user clicks notify me. And it's going to be responsible for sending this information to our server. We're not actually going to write this function right now. We're going to define it, but we're going to leave it unwritten because we haven't built our server yet. So there's really no point in writing it. It wouldn't do anything. So we'll just give ourselves a to-do, and then we're going to come back and we're going to write this at the end after we finish setting up our server. And if we take a look at the app in the browser, you can see it's all nicely set up. The CSS for this, you can see if you look at the written tutorial. It's just flexbox and some padding and a little bit of color to make it look appealing. And yeah, this is just capturing our user input, and now we're ready to look at our server. So obviously we're in our front-end client folder here. We need to go into our server folder, and we're going to create a new file in that folder called index.js. And this is where we're going to define our server. And remember, we installed Express at the beginning of this using npm. So we're just going to use that now. And this is just Express boilerplate. It's very simple. We're requiring the Express dependency. We are defining what port we want our app to run on, and then we're going to just create our app by calling Express, and then we're going to tell the app to listen on that port, and we're just going to log a little message to ourselves. And if we take a look in the terminal, we have our front-end client already running because we started that up already. So let's just create a new terminal tab and cd into the project, and we're just going to run our server by cding into our server folder and running node index.js. And now you can see that our server, our backend part of the app, is now listening on that port. So we need a route to handle the requests that are coming from our front end, and we're just going to set it up very basically here. We're going to call it /notify. And Express gives us this request and response object, which is super handy. And for now, all this is doing is sending a response back to our client, and it's a string that just says that the notify route was established. So if we go into the browser here and we look at localhost 3000/notify, there's an error. Why would that? Oh, you know what? It's because I don't have a watcher for changes on the back end, so I need to restart the server manually anytime I make a change. Now we can see if I refresh the page that this notify me route has been established. All right, so obviously we want our route to do more than just send back this response string. So what we're going to do is we're going to have it do what we talked about here. So we've already had the user input their flight number, and we are going to be sending that information when we do onPress notify. So the first thing our server needs to do is check the validity of the email address using the Mailboxlayer API. And you can see I've imported some things here. I'm requiring .env, and then I'm importing all my API keys and API URLs using process.env, and that .env file is holding all of those secret values now. So we just need the Mailboxlayer information for now. And what we're going to do is pull the user email off of the the request that comes in, and we're just going to be sending it as a query string. So Express lets you just grab that by calling rec.query. It gives you access to everything in that query string. And then we will send a request to the Mailboxlayer API using our access key and the sending along the user email. They'll send back a response, and then we're going to check that response to see if the email is valid. And remember, the shape of that JSON response is this. And it gives you all this information about the email that you can use to determine whether the email is valid. For now, we're just going to use this format valid field. If that is true, then we're going to assume that the email is valid. And if the email is valid, then we're going to go on to our next step, which is basically pulling the flight information for that user. So in order to do that, we need to get the flight number and the airport code that the user provided to us. And again, we're going to be sending that from our front end as part of that same query string that we sent the email in. So we can grab it the same way that we got the email. And then we're going to send a request to the Aviationstack API using our access key and appending the flight code and the airport code. And that tells the API that we're only looking for information about this one particular flight. The API is going to send back a response, a JSON response, which we will wait for and parse it to JSON when it comes through. And then once we have that, we can do the next step, which is going to be checking our cache and maybe sending an email based on the result of that check. So how are we going to do that? Well, first things first, we are going to use a try-catch block to handle any errors. And then if you look up here, I have imported a couple of other things. I've imported the file system module that Node gives us that lets us interact with the file system. Because the way we're going to cache this data, it's not really a cache, it's more of just like persisting data. We're just going to save it to a JSON file in the file system. And this flight data file variable is just holding the path to that file. So anytime we need to read or write to the cache, we're going to use that path. And then I just have some error handling down here in the catch block. So again, I'm just gonna paste this code here and then we can walk through it so you guys don't have to sit here and watch me typing it out. Basically, we need to check, first of all, to see if there even is a cache, right? Because the first time we do this, we aren't gonna have any data. We're gonna be just pulling data from the API. So if there is cached data, then we're gonna go in and we're going to read that cache. We're going to use read file sync to pull the information out of the file at this path. And we need to parse it to JSON so that we can work with it in Node. And then we're going to pull the delay and gate information off of the new data that came in from Aviationstack. So remember, we get this data array back. But because we told it we're only looking for one flight, there's only going to be one value in this array. And that flight object has a departure object on it. And on that departure object, there is information about the gate and the delay. And that's what we're looking for. So here, when we pull this delay and gate, we're getting it from the JSON response, the first index of that data field from the departure object. And basically then we're just going to check those new values against the values that we have stored in our cache. And if there is a difference in the gate or the delay, then we're going to send the user an email, and that's going to happen in the next step. But remember, we don't actually do this the first time, right? Because we don't have a cache to check. So the first time this all happens, the only thing that we're actually going to do is down here, we're going to write that data to the cache. And we're actually going to do this every time, whether or not this if block runs, because every time that response comes back, we want to update the cache with the new information that we got. So that's what this is doing here. We're stringifying that data object that came back from Aviationstack in that JSON response, and then we're writing it to a file at that same path. So it overwrites anything that was there before. So the next time we come and check that cache, it'll be the most recently updated data. And then we're just going to send a little response back to the client saying that things went well and that the user has been signed up for email notifications, just so the client, knows what's going on. So let's just quickly recap everything we've done here so far. We've validated the user's email address when the response came in. If that email address is valid, we're then pulling flight data for that user. And then we're checking to see if we have any existing data about that flight. If we do, and if that data is different, we're going to send the user an email to let them know that something changed. And then we're also going to write the new data that we got to our cache so that next time we can check it again. So how are we actually going to send the email to the user? Well, to do that, we're going to need our final backend dependency, and that is NodeMailer. And again, remember, we installed this at the very beginning using npm, and it is listed here in our package.json file. So we can require it now by just pulling it into the file, and then we're going to configure it by calling the create transport function that it gives us and passing it a configuration object. And we're telling it we want to use Gmail to send the email. And to authenticate ourselves to Gmail, we're going to tell Gmail our email address, the email address that we want to use to send emails. And then we're going to use that app password that we set up earlier. So remember, we signed up doing this Google account. We told them the name of our app, and it gave us a code that popped up on the screen here. That's the code that you're going to put right here to authenticate your app with Gmail. And that lets you use NodeMailer to send emails from your personal email address. This is really just for testing purposes or for this tutorial. You wouldn't really ever do anything like this in production. You would use a proper mailing service like Mailtrap or something like that. But because this is just a tutorial, I think this is probably fine for now. All right, so we have imported NodeMailer and we've set it up. Now we just need to send the email. And doing that is actually super simple. We'll just get rid of this comment here. And I'm gonna paste it again because otherwise it takes forever to type it out, and we can just walk through it. So this mail options object is just telling NodeMailer what you want to send. You're going to tell it the email address it's coming from, and that's the same one that you use to configure the email. And then you're sending it to that same user email that we got from our user. Give it a subject, and then in the body, you're going to tell the user basically what happened. So here's your flight number, and here's what's new. There's a new delay, or there's a new gate. Basically, here's the new information about your flight. And then to send the email, we call transporter.sendEmail, and it uses this object that we configured earlier to send a mail with these options that we just told it. And then there's just a little bit of error handling, and if all goes well, we will just log a little note to the console and pat ourselves on the back. All right, so the mechanics of everything are set up here now. We're persisting data to the cache. We're sending an email if the cache looks different from what just came in. We're handling our errors. But what we really want to do is not just run this once, right? We want this function to run automatically. We want the user to get an email if anything has changed without the user having to do anything. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to pull that endpoint for updates. And so we're going to write just a basic polling function, and this doesn't have any rate limiting or caching or anything like that on it. It's just a very, very simple polling function. It takes a function as an argument, and then it calls that function on an interval, and we are defaulting to 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, basically, this function that we pass to this polling function is going to be called. And the function that we're going to pass to it is basically everything we did in here. So we don't really need to validate the user's email every time. I think we can assume that once we validated that, that'll be fine. So all we want to do is check the Aviationstack API, pull the newest data, check it against the cache, send an email if it's different, and then cache the data. So let's pull this out into a separate function so that we can pass that function to our poll. And we'll call it check flight data and notify. And we're just going to paste into it all of that code that does all that stuff. And it needs to be an async function, obviously, so that we can still use our awaits in here. And then we're going to need to pass it the request object and the response object that we get from Express, so that we still have access to those inside this function. Because remember, we need to pull the user's email and all that information, and then we need to send a response back to the client. So now, after we've checked if the email is valid, instead of just running all that code, we're now going to start our polling function. And so to do that, we're going to call the function. We're going to pass it the function that we just wrote as a parameter. We're going to use a closure to close around the arguments, or excuse me, the variables, I guess, that we need to pass as arguments. And then we're going to catch any errors and, log them to the console. And if we were doing this properly, we would also handle those much better, but we're not doing that for now. So now when our front end sends a request to this notify endpoint, we validate the email address, and instead of just doing all this once, we now start a poll that is going to run that function every 5 minutes. And that will automatically send an email to the user if anything has changed in their flight. So the last little piece of this puzzle now is to go back to the front end and write that function that we didn't write at the very beginning, our onPress notify me function, because now this is what's going to kick off all that stuff. What we're going to do is when the user taps this button, we are going to send that request to that /notify endpoint, and we're going to do that by just having a query string here with all of our user parameters attached to it. So remember, we captured all of this stuff in state when the user input them into the boxes, and we're just going to send it to the back end. And our back end is going to examine all of those, and it's going to send us a response. When we get that response back, it doesn't matter so much because most of the functionality of this app is happening on the back end, but it's nice to just let the user know that something happened. So we're just going to alert them and say, you've been signed up for email alerts about this flight. And that way the user knows that we've recorded that information and that we're going to automatically send them updates. So let's take a look in the browser and we can test this out now. So I'm just going to randomly put in a flight number. This is United Airlines flight 1004 leaving from LaGuardia. And I'm going to input my email address and I'm going to tap notify me. And now the front end lets me know that I've been signed up for details about this flight. And actually, what's kind of tricky about actually demonstrating this is that in order to demonstrate this, I actually have to mock out the data a little bit because I have no way of knowing whether that United Airlines flight is actually going to be delayed or whether there is going to be a gate change, right? So without that, I can't actually know for sure that this email function is going to trigger and run. So what I'm actually going to do here, just for the purposes of testing this and demonstrating it, is I'm going to use some fake data to trick our server into sending me an email. So I'm going to imagine that this data that I just got back from Aviationstack is telling me that my flight has a delay of 10,000 minutes, which, oh God, I mean, can you imagine? And that my gate has been updated to be 100,000, which again would really suck because I don't think that gate exists at LaGuardia. What this is going to do is it's going to force the app to send me an email with that new fake delay and fake gate data in it. So now if we go back and I tap notify me, that's going to run. It's going to tell me that I've been signed up for alerts. And in 5 minutes time, when the poll runs for the second time, it is going to send me an email with the 10,000 minute delay and my gate of B100,000. And I actually do just want to show this to you guys as well. I'm coming back to this now about 45 minutes later. And this, because I never changed the fake data, the app has just been sending me email notifications every 5 minutes telling me that the flight details have changed because it thinks that they have. But this is actually great because this shows me that that polling function is working, that it is running that code every 5 minutes, and that it is triggering an email, and it is doing basically exactly what we told it to do. So that's great. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Please feel free to check out the Aviationstack API or the Mailboxlayer API, or to play around a little bit with Google App Passwords. Hopefully this gave you some ideas and a good jumping off point to go and build your own app. And I'll see you next time.